When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, Allied armies did not inherit an empty landscape. They inherited a fully functioning administrative machine, damaged, discredited, but intact. Railways still ran. Tax offices still had files. Courts still had clerks. Police stations still had officers. Ministries still had bureaucrats who knew exactly how the system worked. The question facing Allied planners was immediate and unavoidable. Who would run Germany tomorrow morning? Publicly, the answer sounded simple. Nazism would be dismantled, its institutions would be destroyed, its personnel removed. A new democratic order would rise in their place. Privately, planners knew that answer was impossible. You cannot dismantle a modern state overnight without replacing the people who make it function. And there were no neutral replacements waiting in reserve. Germany's administrative class had not been imported from abroad. It had been trained, promoted, and embedded over decades. Removing it entirely would mean collapsing basic governance, law enforcement, courts, utilities, food distribution, transport. Chaos was not a hypothetical risk. It was the default outcome. This reality forced a choice the Allies did not want to advertise. They could pursue moral purity and dismantle the system completely, or they could preserve administrative continuity and accept compromise. They chose continuity. This choice was not ideological. It was logistical. Within days of victory, Allied military governments confronted problems that had nothing to do with Nazism as an ideology and everything to do with survival. Cities needed water. Trains needed scheduling. Warehouses needed inventory control. Millions of displaced people required documentation. Someone had to sign the forms. That someone was almost always a German bureaucrat who had served under the Nazi state. The assumption that these individuals were interchangeable proved false. Technical knowledge was concentrated. Institutional memory mattered. Removing experienced administrators created bottlenecks immediately. Allied officers discovered this the hard way. Early attempts at wholesale removal led to paralysis. Offices emptied. Files became unintelligible. Processes stalled. Food shipments went missing. Courts stopped functioning. The cost of purity became visible within weeks. As a result, denazification, originally envisioned as a sweeping purge, was redefined. The shift was quiet, but decisive. Nazism would be dismantled politically. Administratively, it would be filtered. The language changed first. Instead of asking whether someone had served the Nazi regime, Allied authorities began asking what role they had played. Party membership alone was no longer disqualifying. What mattered was function. Teachers were evaluated differently than police officers, judges differently than propagandists, engineers differently than party officials. This functional approach reclassified millions of Germans. Membership in the Nazi Party, once grounds for removal, became common enough to be treated as background noise. Active ideological leadership was distinguished from passive participation. The bar moved. This shift was justified as realism. Allied planners argued that the Nazi state had coerced participation. Total exclusion would punish survival rather than guilt. More importantly, it would make governance impossible. So a compromise was formalized. Low-level and mid-level administrators would be retained unless clear evidence of criminal behavior existed. Senior ideological figures would be removed. The system would keep running while justice proceeded selectively. Justice, however, moved slowly. Administration did not. The result was a paradox. The Nazi regime was condemned in principle while its personnel operated the post-war state in practice. This paradox was not hidden from Allied leadership. It was debated openly in internal memoranda. The conclusion was consistent across zones. Stability came first. The administrative machine had to be kept alive long enough to replace it gradually. That replacement would take years. Until then, compromise was unavoidable. This logic extended far beyond Germany. In occupied territories across Europe, Allied authorities faced similar dilemmas. Local administrators had worked under occupation. Police forces had enforced occupation laws. Courts had issued rulings under compromised conditions. Total removal would create vacuum. Vacuum invited disorder. So administrators stayed. In Germany, the scale of this decision was unprecedented. Millions of civil servants were evaluated. Questionnaires were issued. Self-declarations were collected. Review boards classified individuals into categories: dangerous, compromised, acceptable, necessary. The category necessary expanded rapidly. Teachers were needed to reopen schools. Engineers were needed to restore utilities. Accountants were needed to manage rationing. Judges were needed to resolve disputes. In many cases, the only people who knew how to do these jobs were men who had sworn loyalty to the Nazi state. Allied authorities rationalized this by separating ideology from competence. You could condemn Nazism while using Nazi-trained administrators. This separation would define the post-war order. It also created a moral debt that would never be fully repaid. Victims of the regime expected accountability. Instead, they saw familiar faces return to offices of authority. Resistance veterans watched as bureaucrats who had survived by compliance resumed control. This bred resentment. Allied planners accepted this cost. They believed resentment was manageable. Chaos was not. The fear driving this decision was not sympathy for former Nazis. It was fear of collapse. Germany in 1945 was starving, bombed out, and administratively fragile. A failed transition could destabilize all of Europe. The decision to reuse administrators was framed as temporary. In theory, denazification would continue in parallel. Over time, compromised individuals would be replaced. New democratic personnel would be trained. In practice, replacement lagged. Once administrators returned to their desks, removing them became harder. They proved indispensable. Their expertise entrenched them. Files they controlled gave them leverage. Temporary solutions became semi-permanent realities. This is how post-war Germany acquired a state apparatus staffed in part by men shaped by the Nazi system. Not because the Allies approved of them, because the Allies needed them. The reuse of administrators was not a betrayal of Allied values. It was a concession to structural reality. Modern states do not run on ideals. They run on systems. The Allies discovered that dismantling a totalitarian state required using the very tools that state had created. This contradiction would haunt post-war Europe. It would shape legal systems, policing, education, and public trust. It would fuel later debates about continuity and guilt. It would complicate the moral narrative of victory. But in 1945, there was no alternative that did not involve risk the Allies were unwilling to take. They chose order over rupture. This choice set the foundation for everything that followed. And it raises the question that defines this episode. How far did the Allies go in reusing Nazi administrators, and what did that decision cost? If you want World War II history beyond battles, the decisions made after victory, the compromises never taught in textbooks, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. This channel documents how power was managed before democracy returned. When the Allies first spoke of denazification, the language was absolute. Nazism would be eradicated, its structures dismantled, its personnel removed from public life. In theory, this meant a clean break between the Third Reich and whatever followed it. In practice, denazification quickly collided with reality. The initial Allied plans imagined a sweeping purge. Party members would be removed, administrators dismissed, courts reconstituted, schools rebuilt from the ground up. The Nazi state would be uprooted entirely. That vision lasted only weeks. The first problem was scale. By 1945, Nazi Party membership was not confined to fanatics. It included millions of Germans, teachers, clerks, engineers, doctors, judges, municipal officials, many of whom had joined for career survival rather than ideological zeal. Removing all of them would mean dismantling the state itself. Allied authorities realized this almost immediately. Questionnaires flooded occupation offices. Forms asking about party membership, rank, affiliations, and wartime roles piled up faster than they could be processed. Review boards were overwhelmed. Files were incomplete. Evidence was scarce. Decision-making slowed to a crawl. Meanwhile, cities still needed to function. The contradiction became obvious. The more aggressively denazification was enforced, the less Germany could be governed. So the definition began to change. The first redefinition was categorical. Instead of treating all party members as equally compromised, Allied authorities introduced gradations. Individuals were classified into categories: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. This categorization transformed denazification from a purge into a filtering process. Only those in the highest categories faced automatic removal. The vast majority were reclassified as followers, a term that implied passivity rather than responsibility. The word mattered. Follower suggested someone carried along by circumstance. It reframed complicity as inertia. It made reintegration administratively acceptable. The second redefinition was functional. Allied authorities began assessing individuals not primarily by ideology, but by utility. Could this person keep trains running? Could they manage food distribution? Could they operate courts? If the answer was yes, their case received leniency. This shift was rarely stated publicly. It emerged through practice. Teachers were among the first beneficiaries. Schools could not reopen without them. New teachers did not exist in sufficient numbers. Many had joined the party simply to remain employed. Judges followed. Courts could not function without trained jurists. Trials could not proceed without legal expertise. Removing all compromised judges meant legal paralysis. So, judges returned, often after brief suspensions, sometimes with cosmetic penalties. Police forces posed an even greater dilemma. Public order depended on them. Yet police had enforced Nazi laws. Allied authorities debated disbandment. They tried partial purges. Crime surged. Disorder followed. The response was pragmatic. Police were screened superficially, senior figures removed where possible, and the rest retained under supervision. Continuity trumped purity. Each sector followed the same pattern. Denazification narrowed from moral judgment to administrative triage. The third redefinition was procedural. Denazification was originally envisioned as centralized and rigorous. In practice, it became decentralized and inconsistent. Local boards made decisions. Standards varied. Personal testimony replaced documentation. As time passed, pressure mounted to accelerate reintegration. The occupation could not last indefinitely. A functioning German administration was required to transition to self-governance. Denazification slowed that transition. So timelines shortened. Reviews became cursory. Appeals were granted generously. Temporary exclusions became temporary inconveniences. The fourth redefinition was political. As Cold War tensions emerged, priorities shifted again. Stability, anti-communism, and economic recovery gained weight. Administrative experience became a strategic asset. Former Nazi administrators were no longer just necessary. They were useful. This shift did not require explicit reversal of denazification policy. It happened through emphasis. Enforcement relaxed. Resources were diverted. Attention moved elsewhere. Denazification faded. What had begun as a moral reckoning ended as a bureaucratic procedure, one that concluded quietly without resolution. Millions were classified. Few were permanently excluded. The outcome was a German state rebuilt on continuity disguised as reform. This did not mean nothing changed. Symbols of Nazism were removed, laws were rewritten, institutions were renamed, elections were held, but beneath the surface, administrative habits persisted. The same filing systems, the same procedural instincts, the same professional networks. Denazification addressed ideology. It did not dismantle structure. Allied authorities knew this. They accepted it. Their calculation was clear. A compromised state that functioned was preferable to a purified state that collapsed. This choice had long-term consequences. Victims saw perpetrators return to authority. Trust eroded. Silence replaced confrontation. Public reckoning was delayed. The moral clarity of victory blurred. But from the Allied perspective, the alternative was worse. Germany could not be rebuilt without Germans, and most Germans who knew how to run the country had lived and worked under Nazism. Denazification, therefore, became a compromise between justice and survival. Survival won. This redefinition shaped post-war Europe profoundly. It influenced how responsibility was discussed, how memory formed, and how legitimacy was constructed. The Nazi state was condemned. Its administrators endured. This was not hypocrisy. It was a trade-off. And it leads to the next question. Once denazification was softened, how far did the Allies go in reusing former Nazi officials, and which institutions relied on them most? Once denazification was redefined from moral purge to administrative filter, the question was no longer if former Nazi officials would return to power, but where their return mattered most. The answer was not uniform. Some institutions absorbed continuity quietly. Others were rebuilt almost entirely around it. The deepest continuity appeared where three conditions overlapped: technical complexity, personnel scarcity, and immediate necessity. Courts were the first and most consequential example. Germany's legal system had not collapsed during the war. It had been repurposed. Judges, prosecutors, and clerks continued to operate throughout the Nazi period, applying laws that increasingly reflected ideological control. After 1945, Allied authorities faced a paradox. They needed courts to prosecute Nazi crimes. But the only people trained to run courts had served under the Nazi legal order. Attempts to remove compromised jurists quickly revealed the problem. Trials stalled, backlogs exploded. Legal procedure broke down. Detention without trial became common, not by design, but by necessity. So judges returned. Many were suspended briefly, questioned, and reinstated. Others were reclassified as followers. Some received minor penalties before resuming careers. The legal system regained functionality, but at a cost. Courts tasked with reckoning with the past were staffed by men shaped by that past. Their instincts favored formalism, restraint, and narrow interpretation. Broad moral reckoning gave way to technical adjudication. Justice became procedural rather than transformative. The police followed a similar trajectory, but with greater urgency. Public order in post-war Germany was fragile. Cities were flooded with displaced persons, returning soldiers, refugees, and black market activity. Crime surged. Allied military police were overstretched. Local policing had to be restored. But policing expertise was concentrated in forces that had enforced Nazi law. Removing them wholesale led to chaos. Allied authorities experimented with disbandment, retraining, and oversight. None of it worked fast enough. So police officers returned. Screening focused on rank and brutality rather than participation. Senior figures associated with repression were removed where possible. The majority were retained under supervision. Continuity was justified as necessity. This decision had profound implications. Police culture emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and authority. These traits had served the Nazi state. They were now repurposed for democratic order, but without fundamental reform. The uniform changed, the habits remained. Education presented a different challenge. Schools were essential to normalization. Children had lost years of schooling. Classrooms were damaged. Textbooks were tainted. Teachers were scarce. Most teachers had been party members. Allied authorities removed overtly ideological educators and rewrote curricula. But the majority returned quickly. Training replacements would take years. Delay risked social collapse, so classrooms reopened with familiar faces. The content changed faster than the culture. Teaching methods, discipline, and institutional norms persisted. Authoritarian pedagogy survived the regime that perfected it. A generation learned democracy from teachers shaped by dictatorship. The civil service was the backbone of continuity. Tax offices, municipal administrations, housing authorities, transport ministries all required specialized knowledge. Files, procedures, and regulations were incomprehensible without experienced personnel. Civil servants returned en masse. Allied authorities focused on top leadership positions, removing visible party figures. The middle layers, the engine of administration, remained largely intact. This created a state that looked new but functioned old. Policies changed, processes endured. Even ministries restructured under new governments relied on former staff to operate. Continuity was invisible to the public, but decisive in practice. Perhaps the most controversial area was the judiciary beyond criminal courts, administrative and constitutional bodies. Legal continuity ensured stability. It also limited reform. Interpretations of law emphasized continuity with pre-1933 legal traditions, bypassing the Nazi period as aberration rather than reckoning. This narrative minimized institutional responsibility. Across these sectors, the pattern repeated. Where expertise was scarce and urgency high, continuity prevailed. Allied authorities did not deny this. They documented it. Internal reports acknowledged that denazification had become selective. The alternative was dysfunction. But selectivity created inequality. Resistance veterans struggled to enter institutions dominated by returning administrators. Victims of the regime saw familiar officials regain authority. Public trust suffered. This distrust was managed rather than resolved. Media, as explored earlier in the series, softened the narrative. Reconstruction was emphasized, continuity was downplayed, stability became the story. Over time, this story hardened. Germany rebuilt itself successfully. Economic recovery accelerated. Political institutions stabilized. From a distance, the compromise appeared justified, but the cost was deferred. Questions about responsibility lingered unresolved. Institutional memory remained fragmented. Silence replaced accountability. Later generations would confront these issues through scholarship, protest, and legal reform, but always against the inertia of continuity. The Allied decision to reuse administrators did not preserve Nazism. It preserved administration. That distinction mattered operationally. It mattered less morally. The deeper continuity ran, the harder it became to draw a clean line between past and present. This blurred boundary shaped post-war Germany profoundly. It influenced how authority was perceived, how justice was practiced, and how democracy was internalized. The Allies believed they could manage continuity temporarily. They underestimated how durable institutions are once reactivated. Continuity did not mean stasis. Germany changed dramatically. But the path of change was constrained by who held the levers at the start. Those levers were not neutral. They carried habits, assumptions, and instincts forged under dictatorship. Democracy had to adapt around them. This adaptation succeeded, but imperfectly. The question that follows is unavoidable. Did the Allies have a real alternative? Or was the reuse of Nazi administrators the only viable path to rebuilding a modern state without collapse? That question sits at the heart of this episode, and it leads directly to the moral reckoning that could not be avoided forever. Administrative continuity solved immediate problems. It created others that could not be fixed with paperwork. As former Nazi administrators returned to offices, courts, classrooms, and police stations, a quiet moral fracture opened beneath post-war society. It did not explode. It spread slowly through resentment, silence, and distrust. For those who had suffered under the regime, continuity felt like betrayal. Survivors of persecution expected rupture. They expected the collapse of authority to mean the disappearance of the men who had enforced it. Instead, they encountered familiar faces behind new desks, wearing new titles, speaking the language of democracy with the cadence of the old order. The state had changed. Its voice often had not. This dissonance was especially sharp for resistance veterans. Many had risked their lives sabotaging the Nazi system. They had operated outside institutions because those institutions had become instruments of repression. Liberation, in their eyes, was supposed to reverse that hierarchy. Instead, resistance fighters were thanked, decorated, and marginalized. They were honored symbolically, but excluded structurally. Administrative positions went to men with files, experience, and procedural fluency, qualities resistance veterans rarely possessed. The skills of survival were rewarded over the courage of defiance. This produced bitterness. Resistance networks had expected influence. They received recognition without power. Former administrators regained authority, while those who had opposed the regime struggled to find roles in the new order. Allied planners understood this tension. They accepted it as collateral damage. They believed resistance movements were politically volatile. Their moral authority could translate into radical demands. Stability required tempering that influence. Continuity served that goal. For victims of Nazi persecution, especially those whose suffering had been legalized by courts and enforced by police, the return of officials was devastating. Judges who had applied racial laws now presided over post-war cases. Police officers who had enforced deportations now maintained public order. Teachers who had taught racial doctrine now taught civics. The message was unmistakable. The system could condemn crimes without condemning the system that enabled them. This realization undermined trust. Many victims withdrew from public life. Others emigrated. Some pursued justice through testimony and legal action, only to encounter procedural barriers administered by familiar hands. Justice felt procedural rather than moral. This was not because Allied authorities dismissed suffering. It was because their priorities lay elsewhere. Stability required reconciliation without full reckoning. That reconciliation was administrative, not emotional. Public discourse reflected this choice. Media narratives emphasized reconstruction and forward movement. Dwelling on continuity was discouraged. Discussion of institutional complicity faded quickly from headlines. Silence became policy. This silence was not imposed by censorship alone. It was reinforced socially. To question continuity was to threaten recovery. To insist on reckoning was to appear disruptive. Victims were expected to endure quietly. The moral cost of continuity also appeared in legal outcomes. Prosecutions were narrow, focus rested on extreme crimes rather than systemic participation. Responsibility was individualized, isolating guilt to a small number of perpetrators. This approach absolved institutions by omission. It allowed society to believe that evil had been contained within identifiable villains rather than embedded in everyday governance. That belief was comforting. It was incomplete. The cost extended into political culture. Democracy rebuilt itself atop institutions that had not fully confronted their past. As a result, democratic norms were introduced into environments still shaped by authoritarian habits. Obedience persisted. Deference to authority lingered. Legal formalism overshadowed moral inquiry. Citizens learned democracy from institutions that had not practiced it themselves. This inheritance complicated political maturation. Public debates about responsibility emerged later, often explosively. Student movements, historians, and activists challenged the silence decades after the fact. Their demands reflected unresolved tensions from the transition period. The reckoning delayed did not disappear. It accumulated. Allied planners underestimated this accumulation. They believed that economic recovery and political normalization would absorb moral discontent. To some extent, they were right. Material stability softened outrage. Time diluted anger. But time also hardened questions. Why had so many officials returned? Who had decided this? What justice had been sacrificed? These questions haunted post-war societies. The moral cost of continuity was not uniform. Some communities adapted more easily, others remained divided. The depth of resentment correlated with visibility. Where continuity was most visible, courts, police, schools, trust eroded fastest. Where it was hidden, ministries, civil service, its impact surfaced later. This unevenness distorted public understanding. Many citizens sensed something was wrong without being able to name it. Authority felt familiar but unaccountable. The past seemed both condemned and present. This ambiguity undermined confidence. Allied authorities recognized some of these effects. Internal reports acknowledged public dissatisfaction. But by the time concern grew, the system was already entrenched. Reversing continuity would mean destabilizing the state again. The opportunity for clean rupture had passed. This is the central tragedy of post-war reconstruction. The Allies chose continuity to prevent collapse. In doing so, they postponed reckoning. The delay made reckoning harder. Moral clarity requires confrontation. Confrontation requires disruption. Disruption was precisely what the Allies sought to avoid. So morality was deferred. The cost was borne unevenly. Those least affected by the Nazi system reintegrated easily. Those most harmed carried memory without institutional recognition. This imbalance shaped national identity. Germany, and much of post-war Europe, rebuilt itself around narratives of recovery rather than accountability. The success of Reconstruction became proof that compromise had been necessary. Success justified silence. Only later, when stability was secure, could societies afford to question their foundations. But foundations, once set, resist change. The moral cost of continuity is not measured in policy outcomes alone. It is measured in trust withheld, voices silenced, and questions postponed. It is measured in the distance between legal judgment and lived experience. Understanding this cost does not negate the Allied achievement of Reconstruction. It contextualizes it. Victory required compromise. Compromise required forgetting. Forgetting required silence. That silence would not last forever. And when it broke, it would force societies to confront a truth buried since 1945. Stability had been purchased with moral debt. The decision to reuse Nazi administrators is often explained as unavoidable. Allied planners themselves framed it that way. They spoke of necessity, urgency, and lack of options. But inevitability deserves scrutiny. Were there real alternatives, or was continuity chosen because it was convenient? In the months surrounding Germany's collapse, Allied authorities did consider other paths. None were easy. All carried risks. What matters is not that alternatives were absent, but that they were rejected. The first alternative was total administrative rupture. This option envisioned dismantling the Nazi state completely and rebuilding governance from the ground up. All party-affiliated administrators would be removed. New personnel would be trained rapidly. Allied officials would temporarily fill the gaps. On paper, This approach satisfied moral clarity. In practice, it collapsed almost immediately. Allied forces were overstretched. Military governments were designed to occupy, not to administer complex civilian societies indefinitely. Language barriers, unfamiliar legal systems, and sheer scale made direct Allied administration unsustainable beyond a short period. Germany was not a small territory. It was a modern industrial society of tens of millions. Replacing its entire administrative class would require an occupation apparatus far larger than anything the Allies had prepared. The second alternative was internationalized administration. Some planners proposed bringing in administrators from other countries, exiled Germans, neutral officials, or international civil servants, to staff key institutions temporarily. This idea failed for two reasons. First, numbers. There were not enough qualified personnel available to replace German administrators at scale. Second, legitimacy. Foreign administrators risked deepening resentment. Governance by outsiders would undermine claims of sovereignty and delay normalization. Occupation was already sensitive. Prolonging foreign rule invited resistance. The third alternative was radical decentralization. Instead of restoring a centralized state quickly, Germany could be governed locally, with power devolved to municipalities and regions while new leadership emerged organically. This approach appealed to some Allied thinkers. It aligned with fears of centralized authority. It promised democratic experimentation from the ground up. But decentralization clashed with immediate needs. Food distribution, transportation, and currency required coordination. Fragmentation threatened collapse. Local authorities lacked resources and expertise. Decentralization was a long-term aspiration, not a short-term solution. The fourth alternative was reliance on resistance movements. Resistance groups had legitimacy. They had opposed the regime. They commanded moral authority. Some Allied observers believed they should form the backbone of post-war governance. This option frightened planners. Resistance movements were diverse, ideologically charged, and often internally divided. Some leaned radical. Others lacked administrative experience. Their authority derived from struggle, not governance. Allied leaders feared that empowering resistance groups could produce instability, factionalism, or revolutionary politics. The war had just ended. Another conflict was unacceptable, so resistance was sidelined. The fifth alternative was slower reconstruction with tighter control. Instead of restoring administration quickly, the Allies could have accepted prolonged disruption while conducting deeper purges and training replacements. This option was considered and rejected. Prolonged disruption meant prolonged suffering. Food shortages, homelessness, disease, and unrest would worsen. Public opinion would turn against the occupation. Legitimacy would erode. The political cost was deemed too high. Each alternative failed the same test. They risked instability. The Allies were willing to compromise on justice, ideology, and moral symbolism. They were not willing to risk collapse. This reveals the core priority guiding post-war decisions. Stability was not just one objective among many. It was the overriding constraint. Within that constraint, continuity became the least dangerous option. But least dangerous does not mean inevitable. The Allies chose continuity because it minimized short-term risk. They accepted long-term consequences as manageable or deferrable. This choice reflects a broader pattern in state building. Modern states prioritize functionality. Moral renewal is secondary. Ideological transformation is slow. Administrative systems endure. The Allies understood this intellectually. They had studied the failures of post-World War I reconstruction. They believed that abrupt collapse of authority created conditions for extremism. They were determined not to repeat that mistake. So they erred in the opposite direction. Where the post-World War I order collapsed through weakness, the post-World War II order would be stabilized through continuity, even compromised continuity. This calculation was reinforced by emerging geopolitical concerns. As tensions with the Soviet Union increased, Western Germany's stability became strategically vital. Administrative competence was now a security asset. Continuity shifted from reluctant compromise to strategic advantage. At that point, alternatives became irrelevant. Once Cold War logic entered the equation, denazification lost urgency. Former administrators were not just tolerated, they were relied upon. This transition reveals the deeper truth. The reuse of Nazi administrators was not merely a response to chaos in 1945. It was integrated into a broader strategy of rapid normalization, economic recovery, and geopolitical alignment. Justice could wait. Stability could not. Could the Allies have chosen differently? Yes, but only by accepting greater short-term disruption and uncertainty. They judged that price unacceptable. Whether that judgment was correct remains contested. What is certain is that the path chosen shaped post-war Germany in enduring ways. It defined the relationship between state and society. It influenced how responsibility was discussed. It delayed reckoning. The Allies did not preserve Nazism. They preserved the machinery that Nazism had used. That machinery proved adaptable. It served democracy as it had served dictatorship. This adaptability is both a testament to institutional resilience and a warning about moral flexibility. States survive by continuity. Justice often demands rupture. The Allies chose survival, and by doing so, they ensured that the reckoning with the past would not occur at the moment of victory, but decades later, when the cost of confronting it would be social rather than administrative. This is the unresolved legacy of their decision. The decision to reuse Nazi administrators did not end with reconstruction. It extended forward, quietly, persistently, into the political culture, legal norms, and collective psychology of post-war Germany. Continuity did not simply stabilize the state, it shaped the kind of democracy that emerged. In the early years, the effects were subtle. Institutions functioned, elections were held, economic recovery accelerated. From the outside, the transition appeared successful. Germany rebuilt faster than many had expected. But beneath that success, unresolved tensions accumulated. One of the most immediate consequences was a fragile relationship between citizens and authority. The state returned quickly. Trust did not. For many Germans, authority felt familiar but unexamined. Officials spoke the language of democracy, but their manner, procedures, and instincts reflected older habits. Decision-making remained opaque. Deference was expected. Legalism outweighed moral explanation. Citizens learned to comply before they learned to question. This dynamic slowed democratic maturation. Democracy requires not just institutions, but confidence that those institutions are morally legitimate. Where continuity blurred accountability, legitimacy remained conditional. People obeyed the state. They did not necessarily believe in it. The legal system illustrated this tension clearly. Courts functioned efficiently. Law was applied rigorously. But the scope of legal inquiry remained narrow. Judges emphasized statutes and precedent. Broader questions of responsibility were often excluded as political rather than legal. This approach reinforced stability. It also limited reckoning. Crimes were prosecuted selectively. Structural complicity remained largely untouched. The legal narrative framed Nazism as a criminal deviation imposed on an otherwise sound system. That framing protected institutions. It also postponed confrontation with uncomfortable truths about how ordinary governance had enabled extraordinary crimes. This postponement shaped legal culture for decades. German law became meticulous, formal, and cautious. Moral ambition gave way to procedural restraint. The judiciary gained independence, but not immediately introspection. Education reflected a similar pattern. Schools reopened quickly. Curricula changed. Nazi ideology was removed. But the deeper pedagogical culture, hierarchy, discipline, authority, persisted. Teachers trained under dictatorship taught democracy. This did not produce authoritarianism. It produced ambivalence. Students learned democratic principles intellectually while experiencing authority structurally. Participation was encouraged in theory, moderated in practice. This contradiction would surface later. In the 1960s, a generation raised in this system began to ask questions their teachers could not answer. Why had so many officials returned? Why had institutions remained silent? Why had justice seemed incomplete? These questions did not emerge spontaneously. They were delayed consequences. The silence of the early post-war years created a vacuum that later filled with confrontation. Student movements, historians, journalists, and activists challenged the narratives inherited from Reconstruction. They exposed continuity. They named complicity. They demanded accountability. This reckoning was intense precisely because it had been postponed. Had confrontation occurred earlier, it might have been less explosive. Instead, it arrived when institutions were entrenched and authority less flexible. Continuity made the reckoning harder. Public trust suffered in cycles. Each revelation about former officials reignited doubts. Each exposure reopened wounds thought healed. Society oscillated between defensiveness and introspection. The process was painful, but necessary. The long shadow of continuity also influenced political alignment. Early post-war politics emphasized moderation, consensus, and stability. Radical change was viewed with suspicion. This consensus helped rebuild the country. It also constrained political imagination. Policies favored gradualism. Institutions changed incrementally. Reform occurred cautiously. The memory of collapse and fear of chaos discouraged experimentation. This culture of caution was inherited from the transition. Internationally, continuity facilitated integration. Germany became a reliable partner. Its administrative competence reassured allies. Its stability supported broader European recovery. In this sense, the Allied decision achieved its strategic goal. But strategic success does not erase moral ambiguity. The coexistence of democratic success and unresolved accountability created a distinctive post-war identity, one marked by achievement and introspection, pride and unease. Germany's later commitment to historical responsibility emerged precisely because early reckoning had been incomplete. The burden of memory did not disappear. It shifted forward. Continuity delayed justice, but it did not eliminate it. It transformed it from immediate reckoning into generational struggle. This transformation shaped how history was written. Early histories emphasized recovery and normalization. Later histories focused on continuity and complicity. The narrative evolved as archives opened and silence broke. The past became contested terrain. This evolution underscores the paradox of the Allied decision. By preserving administrative continuity, the Allies enabled rapid recovery and democratic stability. By doing so, they also ensured that moral reckoning would occur later, under different conditions, with different stakes. Justice delayed became justice debated. The long shadow of continuity thus extends beyond Germany. It offers a lesson about transitions from authoritarianism to democracy. Institutions matter. So does timing. Rapid stabilization can secure peace, but postpone truth. Delayed truth can deepen understanding, but intensify conflict. There is no clean solution. The Allies chose a path shaped by fear of collapse and memory of past failure. They prioritized survival of the state over purification of its soul. That choice worked, but imperfectly. The democracy that emerged was resilient, cautious, and self-critical. Its self-criticism was earned through struggle rather than granted at birth. The cost of that struggle traces back to 1945. Continuity made democracy possible. It also made democracy complicated. Understanding this complexity is essential to understanding post-war Europe. It explains why the war did not end neatly in memory. It explains why debates about responsibility persisted long after Reconstruction. The shadow of continuity reminds us that victory does not resolve moral questions. It relocates them. And it challenges the comforting belief that rebuilding erases the past. It does not. It carries it forward, sometimes silently, sometimes explosively, until it is finally confronted. The reuse of Nazi administrators after 1945 was never announced as a doctrine. It was never framed as a grand strategy. It emerged quietly, case by case, office by office, justified each time as temporary, exceptional, unavoidable. And yet, taken together, these exceptions formed one of the most consequential decisions of the post-war world. The Allies did not merely defeat Nazi Germany, they decided how its state would survive. That decision rested on a belief shaped by fear as much as experience, that the collapse of authority was more dangerous than the compromise of justice. That a functioning administration, even a compromised one, was preferable to moral purity followed by chaos. This belief was not abstract, it was grounded in memory. The Allies remembered the aftermath of the First World War. They remembered institutional collapse, political radicalization, and the vacuum that extremism filled. They were determined not to repeat that history. So when faced with the ruins of the Third Reich, they chose continuity as insurance. Insurance against hunger, insurance against unrest, insurance against another catastrophe. This choice stabilized Germany. It allowed reconstruction to proceed. It made economic recovery possible. It anchored Germany within a Western political order that would endure. Measured by those outcomes, the decision succeeded. But success came at a price that could not be quantified in logistics or GDP. It came in the form of delayed justice, fractured trust, and unresolved memory. By reusing administrators trained under dictatorship, the Allies preserved systems that had proven adaptable, but also morally flexible. These systems learned to serve democracy as they had served authoritarianism, not by transformation, but by adjustment. This adaptability was efficient. It was also unsettling. It meant that the transition from dictatorship to democracy occurred without a full institutional reckoning. Responsibility was individualized. Structures were spared. The state condemned its past while relying on those shaped by it. This contradiction defined post-war governance. For victims, it meant seeing the past walk back into authority. For resistance veterans, it meant recognition without power. For society, it meant stability without closure. The reckoning that did not happen in 1945 happened later, louder, angrier, and more painful, because it had been postponed. That postponement shaped generations. The Germany that emerged was democratic, prosperous, and deeply self-critical. Its self-criticism was not inherited at birth. It was earned through decades of confrontation with continuity. This makes the Allied decision neither a moral failure nor a moral triumph. It was a trade-off, a deliberate exchange of immediate justice for long-term stability. The Allies chose to secure the peace first and leave the past unsettled. They assumed that time would allow societies to confront their history once survival was assured. In the end, that assumption proved partially correct. Reckoning did come, but it came on different terms. The lesson of this decision is not that continuity was wrong or that rupture was possible without cost. It is that transitions are never clean, and that power exercised in the name of stability always leaves traces. Democracy does not emerge from ruins untouched. It emerges shaped by the tools used to rebuild it. In 1945, those tools included men who had served a criminal regime, not because they were forgiven, but because they were necessary. That necessity explains the peace that followed. It also explains the unease that never fully disappeared. Victory ended the war. It did not end the past. The Allies understood that governing a defeated society required compromise. What they could not control was how long that compromise would echo. That echo is still heard in institutions, in memory, in the persistent question of whether stability justified the silence that followed. This is the classified history beneath the familiar one. If you want World War II history beyond the battlefield, the decisions made after victory, the compromises that shaped the peace, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. This channel documents how the post-war world was built before democracy fully returned. If you want to support this work directly, you can do that on Patreon. Your support keeps these long-form investigations independent, document-driven, and uncompromised. The link is in the description.